in the rugged heart of the untamed frontier, where cattle herds thundered across the open plains, and every sunrise carried the promise of fortune or failure. One choice would stir whispers far and wide. Hamilton Hammer Mallister, the most powerful cattle baron this side of Dodge City, had carved an empire from dust and determination. He commanded loyal men, owned endless land, and possessed more wealth than most towns combined. Yet one thing still eluded him: a wife. When word spread that he would finally marry, the world expected a dazzling beauty from the East. Instead, he chose Harriet Hattie Blake, a woman dismissed as plain. What followed would defy every rumor and change the prairie forever. The photographer captured the moment. Hammer Stowe in the blistering summer of 1878, the Kansas plains stretched wide and unforgiving, their ochre soil baked hard beneath the relentless sun. Dust curled around the hooves of cattle, rising like smoke as herds moved across the brittle land. Wagons groaned along the rutted roads, their wheels sinking into cracked earth, while stagecoaches rattled, carrying merchants, drifters, and fortune-seekers toward Dodge City. This was cattle country, raw, wild, and untamed, where the strongest men carved legacies from the dust, and the weakest were swallowed whole by the prairie winds. Among these men was Hamilton Hammer Mallister, a figure both feared and respected across 4 territories. He was no mere rancher, he was an empire builder. 10 years earlier, Hammer had arrived with little more than a borrowed horse, a stubborn will, and a half-starved herd. Where others failed, he endured. He negotiated with shrewd calculation, fought with cold steel when pressed, and defended every inch of land with an iron fist. From those humble beginnings, he forged Mallister Range, 25,000 acres of prime grazing land, dotted with thousands of longhorn cattle. The ranch was no ordinary spread. Mallister Range was guarded by men loyal to Hammer Alone Ranch, hands hardened by sun, whiskey, and gunpowder. They were a small army, as tough as coffin nails, patrolling the fences, chasing off rustlers, and keeping would-be settlers at bay. To outsiders, the main house loomed like a fortress in the center of the range, built of sturdy timber and reinforced with stone. It was less a home, more a monument to Hammer's success, a place that declared his power to anyone bold enough to ride close. But even the strongest fortress cannot protect a man from whispers. And for all his land, wealth, and cattle, Hammer Mallister carried a burden that gnawed at him in the shadows of the night. At 35 years of age, he was still unmarried. Society noticed. In the parlors of Dodge City and in the salons of Abilene, the wealthy ranchers, the Farnsworths, the Claytons, the McDowells spoke of him with a mix of envy and disdain. They could not deny his ruthlessness in business, nor the empire he commanded, but yet Hammer was not without his own brand of pragmatism. He believed that one day, perhaps, a marriage might serve his interests, if not for love, then for partnership, a union of practicality. And that arrangement arrived one scorching July afternoon, carried not by a whisper of romance, but by the ink of a letter. The letter came from a distant cousin, written in smudged script on a sheet of dust-stained paper. It spoke of Harriet Hattie Blake, the daughter of a once prosperous rancher in Texas. Her family's land had been swallowed by drought, and devoured by bankers, with sharper teeth than wolves. Her father was dead, her fortune gone, without hesitation, Hammer sent word. He would pay her passage to Dodge City. If she agreed to marry him, she would find security, a home, and a purpose at Mallister Range. Days later, when Harriet's acceptance arrived, the entire ranch buzzed with hushed speculation. Ranch hands smirked behind calloused palms, joking about the homely bride. But their whispers died quickly under Hammer's glare. The boss's word was law, and Harriet Blake was on her way. The day of her arrival dawned hot and heavy. Heat shimmered across the horizon like molten glass. Outside the Dodge City station, Hammer stood with his two foremen, Jude and Cody, both men tall, broad-shouldered and grim-faced beneath wide-brimmed hats. Around them bustled travelers, traders, and townsfolk, kicking up clouds of dust as they moved through the station yard. Horses whinnied nervously at the clamor of the incoming stagecoach. When the coach finally rattled to a halt, Jude nudged Hammer with a subtle gesture. "That her, boss?" he muttered, tilting his chin toward a slender figure descending the steps. She wore a faded gray dress, its hem darkened by miles of dirt road. A bonnet shaded her face, but her posture revealed something uncommon. Straight-backed, chin high, the stance of someone who refused to yield. As she pushed the bonnet back, Hammer, towering in his dark suit, stepped forward. Removing his hat, he spoke with a curt nod. "Welcome to Dodge City, Miss Blake." Harriet clutched a modest valise, her grip firm despite the tremor in her voice. "Mr. Mallister, thank you for meeting me." In that instant, before the stares of the crowd and the whispers of doubters, the cattle baron and the plain woman stood face to face. Neither yet knew how this union born of necessity would ignite a firestorm that would shake the frontier to its very core. The wagon creaked and jolted as Hammer Mallister guided Harriet away from the noise of Dodge City. Dust clung to every surface, coating the wooden slats, the horse's flanks, and the folds of Harriet's simple dress. She sat beside Hammer in silence, her calloused hands folded neatly over the small valise she carried, her green eyes fixed on the endless horizon. Hammer glanced at her only once in that first stretch of road, studying the determined set of her jaw. She was grateful, yes, but guarded, and he understood. When they crested the final ridge, Mallister Range spread out before them like a kingdom carved into the earth. Herds of longhorn moved across the pastures in thick clouds of dust. Massive barns rose like cathedrals of timber, surrounded by bunkhouses and corrals that pulsed with life. At the center stood the main house towering, fortified, a fortress of stone and wood. Harriet stared, lips parted, astonishment in her eyes. She had heard tales of its size, but to see it with her own eyes was something else entirely. Hammer drew the horses to a halt at the front steps. "Tomorrow I'll show you around," he said. "Then we'll talk about the wedding." Harriet glanced at him, and in the fading light offered the smallest of smiles. It softened her plain features. In a way Hammer had not expected. He looked away, unused to warmth, but a flicker of admiration stirred in his chest. 3 days later, Dodge City's modest chapel bore witness to the most curious wedding it had seen in years. The preacher, his Bible worn and his voice weary, read the vows under stained glass windows that let in beams of dusty sunlight. Hammer stood stoic, his jaw set, while Harriet, dressed in simple gray, raised her chin with quiet dignity. When the vows were complete, Hammer inclined his head, awkwardly pressing a brief kiss to her cheek. It was done. Harriet Blake became Harriet Mallister, owed stiff, lips pressed into a thin attempt at a smile. Harriet squinted against the glare of the sun, her arms straight at her sides. The photograph would soon hang behind the bar at The next morning, Harriet rose before dawn. She pulled on plain trousers and a work shirt, ignoring the gasps of the kitchen staff. The cook stammered, "Mrs. Mallister, wouldn't you prefer a gown?" Harriet only smiled faintly. "A gown won't do me much good in the saddle." Boots echoing against the wooden floors, she strode into the stables where Jude, Cody, and the other ranch hands lounged half awake. Their surprise was evident when Harriet saddled her own Mari with practiced ease. Jude spat a stream of tobacco into the straw. "Boss didn't say you'd be joining us this morning." "I want to understand this ranch," Harriet said calmly. "I was raised on one in Texas. I know the basics, but every place is different." "Let's ride." The men exchanged uncertain glances, but when Harriet mounted with the easy grace of long practice, they shrugged. If the new mistress wanted to ride, who were they to argue? Through the golden haze of dawn, they rode across Mallister Range. Harriet studied everything, the grazing longhorns with their curling horns, the stretch of pasture, the condition of the fences, the water levels in the streams. She asked more questions, sharp and unrelenting. She dismounted often, kneeling to test the soil, pulling at tufts of brittle grass, noting the thinning pasture dot. By the time they returned, her brow was furrowed in thought. Hammer emerged from his office as the group rode into the yard. Harriet swung down from her horse, dust streaking her boots. "It's an impressive spread," she said. "But you're overstocking the western pasture. If you don't rotate, you'll have a shortage by winter. And your streams are drying up. You need wells." The ranch hands froze, bracing for Hammer's fury. He was not a man who tolerated. The weeks that followed Harriet's arrival were unlike anything the ranch hands had expected. Most had wagered she would retreat into the main house, occupying herself with embroidery, tea, and the occasional stroll across the porch. But Harriet Mallister proved them all wrong. Each morning before the rooster crowed, she was already awake, boots laced, hair tied back, ready to ride. She joined the men on cattle drives, inspected fencing, and oversaw branding with a stern eye. At first, the ranch hands chuckled at her presence, muttering jokes about the plain-faced lady boss. But when she outlasted them under the scorching sun, when she matched them stride for stride, and when she spoke with knowledge rather, then vanity, the laughter faded. Jude, Hammer's grizzled foreman, was the first to take notice. He had worked cattle for 2 decades, his skin leathered by wind and whiskey, his patience thin. But even he couldn't deny Harriet's grit. One evening, as the men gathered by the bunkhouse fire, Jude spat into the dirt and muttered, "She may not look like much, but that woman's tougher than half of us." The others nodded, though none dared voice it too loud. They still feared Hammer's reaction, for his pride was a wall as tall as the main house itself. Yet even Hammer could not ignore the change. He would rise from his desk to find Harriet bent over maps of the range, scribbling notes on grazing rotations. But Harriet's greatest challenge was not the skepticism of the ranch hands, nor even the silence of her husband. It was the gaze of Dodge City society. Word of their marriage spread like wildfire. Every saloon, every parlor, every dusty back alley rang with laughter. Hammer Mallister, they said, could have had any woman in the territories, and he chose her. Women sneered, men chuckled, and even the preacher who had married them shook his head in disbelief. The cruelest of these voices belonged to Silas Farnsworth, Mallister's greatest rival. A rancher of vast means and greater arrogance, Farnsworth had long envied Hammer's empire. He owned sprawling lands east of the river, but his ambition was larger still. The marriage of his rival was an opportunity too rich to ignore. At a gathering in the Grand Farnsworth estate, beneath chandeliers imported from New Orleans, Silas raised a glass of brandy and let his laughter boom across the room. Mallister has finally shackled himself, he proclaimed, and not to a jewel, but to a lump of coal. Mark my words, this Harriet Blake will be his undoing. Guests tittered, eyes glinting with malice. To them, Harriet was not a wife, she was a weakness. And in the brutal world of cattle and land, weakness was blood in the water. Back at Mallister Range, Harriet was not blind to the ridicule. Letters arrived from distant relatives, dripping with false pity. Even the town's shopkeepers offered her condescending smiles, their voices sweet but mocking beneath the surface. One afternoon, while riding into Dodge City for supplies, Harriet overheard two women at the mercantile whispering near the bolts of fabric. "Poor thing," one said with a smirk. "She'd never be more than his plain shadow." Harriet did not confront them. She did not cry. Instead, she squared her shoulders and stepped to the counter with her list. Her voice was calm, her gaze steady. She bought tools, rope, and seed, not silks or lace. And when she rode back to the ranch with her wagon loaded, the men noticed the steel in her eyes. That night, as she stood on the porch, staring across the moonlit range, Hammer approached. He lingered in silence, his presence heavy beside her. Finally, he spoke. "They're talking about you in town," he said. "I know," Harriet replied, her voice steady. "You don't let it bother you?" She turned, meeting his gaze with quiet fire. "Words don't mend fences. They don't feed cattle. Let them talk. I'll prove them wrong in time." Days later, Harriet took her boldest step yet. In front of the ranch hands, with Hammer listening from the corral fence, she laid out a plan for wells and water storage. Her voice carried with certainty as she spoke of digging sites, windmill designs, and the importance of preserving grazing land. The men shifted uneasily, waiting for Hammer's thunderous rejection. But Hammer did not roar. He did not mock. He studied her in silence, the gears of his mind turning. And when she finished, he gave the smallest nod. "Do it," he said. The ranch hands stared in disbelief. Hammer Mallister, the unyielding cattle baron, had given his wife not only his ear, but his blessing. From that day on, Harriet's influence spread across the range. She was no longer dismissed as a plain woman with no place in a man's world. She was Mrs. Mallister, the woman who worked, rode, and fought alongside them. But her trials were only beginning, for Silas Farnsworth, watching from the east, saw her growing presence as a threat to his ambitions. And a man like Farnsworth did not tolerate threats. What Harriet could not yet know was that her grit, her will, her very place at Mallister Range would soon be tested by fire, betrayal, and blood. Silas Farnsworth watched the plains with a predator's patience. From his veranda east of the river, he raised a glass and let gossip roll past. Hammer Mallister had married a plain woman, and she was giving orders. Silas smiled without warmth. Power heeds leverage, not rumor. And leverage is bought by money or by fear. At Mallister Range, Harriet set leverage in the ground. She marked well sites, argued for windmills on the ridges, and split pastures so grass could breathe. The men learned she didn't just talk, she tallied. Hammer, distant at first, began to They rode into a sky bleeding orange. Dust rose like smoke. The river's whisper grew louder. At Cottonwood Bend, the air smelled of damp dirt and cattle fear. Hammer signaled a wide circle. Jude took 3 men upstream. Cody slipped downriver. With 2, Harriet slid from the saddle and crawled to a fallen log, heartbeat loud as a drum. Through the branches she counted silhouettes, watched thieves steady a restless bunch of longhorns corralled with rough rope and brush. A gunshot cracked. The night. Rustlers scattered, muzzle flashes stabbing at the dark. Bullets hissed through leaves. Harriet pressed her cheek to bark, steadying her breath the way her father taught exhale, decide, act. Across the bend she spotted Hammer moving between trunks. Then she saw the danger, a rifleman on a stump, sighting on Hammer's flank. Harriet rose to one knee. The world narrowed to iron and intention. Her pistol bucked. The rifleman lurched, weapon flying, tumbled into the brush. 3 more. Thieves swung fire toward her log. Bark flew. She rolled to the roots and answered with 2 quick shots to pin them. Jude's men replied from the left, Cody's from the right. The ambush broke. Ropes dropped. Horses screamed. Hammer charged, and the ranch hands surged with him. The longhorns, freed from the pen, crashed through brush and stampeded toward open ground. Harriet sprinted to a dangling lead rope and snapped it free. Gunfire dwindled to curses and hoofbeats fading upriver. By dawn the herd stood safe in a holding pasture, heads low. Hammer sent 2 riders to alert the sheriff, another to shadow the fugitives. This wasn't random, he told Jude. Too organized. Too bold. Farnsworth's long money buys. Short tempers, Jude said, wouldn't surprise me. Hammer said nothing. Back at the house, he unrolled a map while Harriet poured coffee. Together, they marked weak points, gullies where riders could slip under fence, windbreaks that hid. Cattle, wire needing replacement, creek crossings best watched at night. Harriet tapped the paper. Set 3 men here, and hang bells on this gate. We'll hear trouble before we see it. Hammer grunted. Put a rider on the well gear, too. If they can't steal our cattle, they'll try to steal our time. News of the foiled raid traveled fast, turning gossip into grudging respect in town and fury east of the river. In his dining room, Silas Farnsworth listened to the report with a face like carved ice. So, he murmured, the plain wife shoots straight. He dismissed the messenger and stared at the bright morning. He calculated. Bring me the man who knows Mallister's habits, he told his foreman. The one with 15 years. On that ranch and a grievance heavy as lead. And somewhere before noon, a rider peeled away from the road to Mallister Range, hat pulled low. His future tied to a different brand. The prairie had tested Harriet with gunfire and dust. And she, did not bend. But men like Farnsworth don't stop at the first fence. They find the gate in a man's pride, or the crack in a loyal heart. The summer heat thickened across the plains, pressing like a heavy hand upon the land. Grass withered to brittle stalks, and cattle bawled restlessly in the shrinking pastures. For Harriet, it was a season of proving herself. Each dawn she walked the range with the men, eyes sharp, mind cataloging every weakness the drought revealed. Her suggestions had already reshaped Mallister Range. Wells were dug, water wheels turned, and her grazing rotations brought relief to tired soil. What once drew sneers now earned nods of quiet respect. She no longer rode at the back of the line. She rode at its heart. But even as the ranch found new strength, shadows deepened. Unknown to Harriet and Hammer, betrayal walked among them. Russell, the seasoned hand with whiskey on his breath and envy in his eyes, had grown restless. Years of loyalty meant little compared to the promise of Farnsworth's coin. Pride burned hotter than duty. Each order from Harriet scraped him raw, each nod she received from Hammer twisted the knife deeper. And so, one stifling evening, Russell rode east under a rising moon. His horse's hooves struck sparks on the stones of the river crossing. Beyond lay Farnsworth's estate-white pillars, manicured grounds, and a master who welcomed traders died inside. The air reeked of cigars and expensive brandy. Farnsworth listened as Russell spoke, voice dripping with bitterness. She runs his ranch now, talks like she owns it. Hammer listens to her every word. Farnsworth leaned back, eyes narrow. And the men? They follow her? One afternoon, as thunderheads gathered on the horizon, Harriet called the men together. She pointed to the western fields, where cattle clustered too close to the creek. That ground will be dust by fall if we don't move them. Push the herd. East, spread them thin. Let the west recover. Russell's voice cut through the air, always telling us how to do our jobs. The yard grew still. Men shifted uneasily. Hammer's eyes narrowed, but Harriet lifted her chin. This isn't about pride, Russell. It's about survival. Ignore the land, and the land will kill you, Russell sneered. Maybe you should leave ranching to men who've lived it their whole lives. For a heartbeat, this silence was taut as a drawn rope. Harriet's voice came quiet but strong. I have lived it, and I'll keep living it, same as you. Question me if you must, but question the land too. See what answer it gives. The men murmured, their loyalty tilting her way. Even Hammer's eyes softened with something close to approval. Russell turned away, jaw tight, his fury hidden but not gone. That night, a storm split the sky. Lightning clawed the horizon, thunder shook the earth, and rain lashed the windows of the main house. Harriet stood by the glass, watching the dark pastures shiver beneath the downpour. She thought of the men in their bunkhouses, of the cattle, huddled in fear, of Hammer sitting silent at the table, his mind grinding over plans and dangers. When morning came, the storm had passed, but left ruin behind. A section of fence lay trampled, posts scattered like bones. Dozens of cattle had strayed into the brush. Harriet and the hands spent hours rounding them up, mud sucking at their boots. And there in the chaos, Russell made his move. He slipped from the line of riders, circling wide, then returning with a grim face. Trails cut, he told Harriet. Cattle scattered north. She frowned. North, that ground's rocky. They wouldn't move that way. They did, Russell. Pressed. I'll take 2 men and fetch them. Her eyes lingered on him. Something in his haste rang false. But she had no proof, and the herd demanded attention. Reluctantly, she nodded. Go, bring them back. Russell rode hard, but not north. East, toward Farnsworth's waiting men. By dusk, word reached Mallister Range. Another herd gone, stolen. Under cover of storm, Hammer cursed, fists pounding the table. Harriet stood beside. The prairie does not reveal its secrets quickly. It hides them in long shadows, in the creak of wind through barbed wire, in the uneasy silence of men who ride side by side but no longer trust one another. At Mallister Range, that silence grew, heavier with each passing day. The herd had been struck again, and suspicion settled like dust on every man's shoulders. Harriet felt it most keenly. She studied the faces at the breakfast table, the weary eyes of Jude, the quiet determination of Cody, the restless glances of Russell. Somewhere among them lay the truth. Somewhere among them beat a heart loyal not to the Mallisters but to Farnsworth. Hammer's temper, sharp as a branding iron, flared often. He paced the porch, barked orders, and spoke of doubling patrols. We'll ride every line until the thief shows his face, he vowed. But Harriet knew fury could blind as easily as it could guide. They needed clarity, not rage. One morning, as dawn spread pale light across the range, Harriet saddled her horse in silence. Jude approached, his broad shoulders hunched. You think it's one of us, he said plainly. I know it is, Harriet answered, but proof matters. Without it, suspicion will eat this ranch from the inside out. Jude spat into the dirt, grim. Then we'll catch him in the act. And so a plan was set. That night, Harriet ordered a small drive of 20 head, seemingly bound for the eastern pasture. The men grumbled at the extra work, but Harriet's expression left no room for debate. As the herd moved under starlight, Harriet and Jude hung back in the shadows, watching. The trap was sprung quickly. Russell slipped from the line, guiding his horse into a gully, away from the others. He paused once, glancing over his shoulder, then spurred east. Jude's hand closed hard on Harriet's arm. There, he whispered. You were right, but Harriet shook her head. Not yet. Let him lead us. They trailed him at a distance, careful and silent, until the glow of lanterns flickered in the distance. Men waited in the scrub. Farnsworth's riders, their coats dark, their rifles slung low. Russell rode straight to them, speaking in urgent tones. Harriet's stomach turned to stone. Betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was truth, laid bare in firelight. When Russell rode back to the herd, Harriet and Jude had already vanished into the hills. They reached the ranch at dawn. There, horses lathered, their faces set. Hammer listened to every word in silence. His fists clenched. Finally, the moment came. Word reached the ranch of a planned raid, a herd driven to market, unguarded by night. Russell carried the news with feigned urgency, insisting on leading the detail himself. Harriet agreed, her face a mask. That night, riders moved out beneath a half-moon. Russell guided them toward the low country, where the grass whispered and the cattle stirred nervously. He signaled for a halt, scanning the horizon. Then, from the east, lanterns appeared Farnsworth's. Men, right on cue, but this time Mallister's riders were not scattered and blind. They were ready. From the ridges, hidden hands lit torches. From the gullies, rifles gleamed. Harriet rode at the front, her pistol drawn, her voice cutting through the night. "Drop your weapons," she commanded. "You'll not steal another. Head from this range." The ambush froze. Farnsworth's men cursed, caught in the trap. Russell's face turned white as bone, his horse skittering beneath him. Hammer rode forward, his eyes locked on the traitor. 15 years, Hammer growled. "And this is how you pay me?" Russell stammered, searching for words. But the silence that followed was worse than any curse. The men who had once called him brother now looked upon him with contempt deeper than the prairie sky. Hammer dismounted, stepping close. He pulled the pistol from Russell's holster with a slow, deliberate hand. "You've chosen your side," he said coldly. "Now live with it." Russell was bound, his head hung low. Farnsworth's men, seeing their plot undone, scattered into the night. A few were captured, most fled east, their anger echoing in the dark. When the dust settled, Harriet sat tall in her saddle, her pistol steady in her grip. She had not only faced betrayal, she had conquered it. And the men saw her not as a shadow of Hammer, nor as a plain-faced wife, but as a leader in her own right. Yet Harriet knew this was not the end. Farnsworth would not forgive humiliation. His pride, larger than the plains, the arrest of Russell sent ripples through the land. Dodge City buzzed with whispers, taverns thick with rumor, parlor rooms alive with speculation. Some marveled at Harriet's cunning, others sneered that she had only fanned the flames of an old feud. But all agreed on one truth: the Mallisters had drawn a line in the dust, and Silas Farnsworth would not let it stand dot at his estate. Farnsworth brooded. The brandy in his glass lay untouched, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. "They think they've humiliated me," he muttered, pacing the length of his study. "They forget who owns the courts, who owns the guns, who owns fear." He turned sharply to his foreman. "If Mallister wants war, I'll give him war, and I'll burn his little wife's courage to ashes." The first strike came not with rifles, but with fire. One night, as Harriet sat on the porch listening to the wind, an orange glow erupted on the southern edge of the range. Bells clanged, shouts rang out, hooves thundered as men scrambled from the bunkhouse. A barn one Harriet herself had ordered repaired was ablaze. Flames licked skyward, sparks scattering into the dry grass. Harriet didn't wait for orders. She ran for the water wagon, shouting to the men, voice sharp as a whip. "Form a line, buckets now." Hammer thundered past, rallying riders to cut a brake line around the barn. Together they fought the inferno, choking smoke clawing at their throats. Eyes stinging with heat. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoldering ruin. They had saved the cattle, but supplies, tools, seed, winter fodder were gone. Hammers, fists clenched in helpless rage. Harriet, soot streaking her face, spoke through the coughing. "They're testing us. They want to see if we'll break." Hammer spat black ash into the dirt. "Then we'll show them we bend, but we do not break." But Farnsworth's attacks did not stop. Days later, riders harried their herd, cutting calves from cows and spooking them into stampedes. Fence lines were slashed, water troughs poisoned. Every blow cost Mallister Range dearly, but each time Harriet met it with resolve. She worked beside the men, patched fences with her own hands, rode night patrol through dusk. One evening, Jude came to her with grim news. "There's talk in town. Farnsworth's hiring gunmen. Men who've killed for less than a sack of gold." Harriet's breath caught, but her voice remained firm. "Then we'll be ready." She devised a plan and idea as daring as it was dangerous. "If Farnsworth wants war, let him bring it to our ground. We'll fortify the northern pasture, build barricades at the creek crossing, and turn the hills into high ground for our rifles. If he comes, he'll bleed for every foot." The men hesitated. It was one thing to chase rustlers, another to prepare for open battle. But Harriet's eyes burned with conviction, and slowly they nodded. "Aye," Jude said, gripping her hand. "We'll stand with you." Hammer, watching from the shadows, realized something he had never dared admit. His empire, his wealth, his very future rested not in his hands, but in hers. And though he was a proud man, he felt no shame in it. He felt gratitude dot the days, past in feverish preparation. Logs were hauled, ditches dug, rifles oiled, and sentries posted. Harriet moved among them like a general, encouraging, correcting, never faltering. The men began to call her the Iron Lady, a name whispered with respect that carried even to Dodge City. Farnsworth heard it, and it stoked his fury. He gathered his hired guns, hard-eyed men from Texas and Missouri, and promised them wealth. And land if they broke the Mallisters. "Ride at dawn," he told them. "Leave nothing standing." The clash came sooner than Harriet expected. In the gray hours before sunrise, the eastern horizon flared with torches. Dozens of riders thundered toward the northern pasture, guns flashing, war cries splitting the air. The ground trembled beneath the assault. Harriet was already mounted, rifle across her saddle. She rode the line, her voice rising above the chaos. "Hold steady. Remember your ground." The men answered with a roar, their rifles cracking. Their barricades holding firm. The first wave smashed into Mallister's defenses. Horses reared, men tumbled, bullets screamed through the dark. Harriet fired calmly, each shot precise, her courage a beacon in the storm. Jude fought beside her, Cody at the far flank, Hammer at the center, his bellow carrying like a war drum. For an hour, the battle raged, smoke and dust, steel and blood. And still the Mallisters. The sun rose red over the prairie, casting long shadows across a land scarred by battle. The smoke of Farnsworth's failed raid still clung to the hills, mingling with the bitter scent of gunpowder. Mallister Range had stood its ground, but the cost was clear. Men bore wounds, cattle scattered, fences lay torn. The ranch survived, yet every soul knew this was not the end. Harriet walked among the wounded, her hand steady though her heart ached. She bound Jude's arm where a bullet had grazed him, spoke comfort to young riders who had never faced death so close. They looked to her with eyes wide and fearful, and she met each gaze with calm resolve. "You fought bravely," she told them, "and because of that, we still stand." Hammer stood apart, silent, his face carved of stone. He watched his wife, the woman the town mocked as plain, tend to his men like a commander and a mother both. Pride swelled in him, but so did unease. Farnsworth had failed once, but Hammer knew his rival too well. A man like Silas would not lick his wounds quietly. He would return with greater fury, and in that silence, Farnsworth was already plotting Dot at his estate. The firelight caught the cold gleam in his eyes. Around him sat his hired guns, fewer now but hardened, their loyalty bought with coin and promises. Mallister bleeds, Farnsworth growled, but not enough. If force won't bring him down, then fear will. He leaned closer, voice dropping to a hiss. Break the people, and the empire falls. His plan unfurled like smoke. Where gunfire had failed, whispers would succeed. He sent men into Dodge City to spread lies that Hammer was losing control, that Harriet's leadership had divided the ranch, that Mallister Range teetered on collapse. Shopkeepers whispered it over counters, gamblers spread it at card tables, and soon every saloon echoed the rumors that the poison reached Mallister's men too. Some doubted in secret, others muttered around campfires. Maybe Farnsworth's right. One said, maybe she's leading us to ruin. Harriet heard the whispers, felt their sting sharper than any bullet, but she did not waver. Instead, she gathered the men by the bunkhouse one evening. The sky burned orange. The wind carried the scent of sage. She stood tall before them, voice carrying like a church bell. You've heard the talk. You've heard the lies. Let me tell you plain, Farnsworth wants us divided. He wants fear to break us before he does. But fear won't mend fences. Fear won't feed cattle. And fear, sure, as hell won't keep this ranch alive. We will not bow to lies. We will ride. We will fight. We will stand as one. Her words struck deep. Murmurs gave way to silence, silence to nods, nods to a cheer that shook the dusk. For a moment, the poison lost its grip. Yet Farnsworth had other schemes. One night, as the moon rose over the plains, a scream shattered the quiet. Flames danced again, this time not in barns, but in homes. A bunkhouse roof crackled with fire. Men scrambled, dragging water barrels, pulling comrades from the smoke. Harriet's skirts caught sparks as she hauled a half-conscious boy from the doorway. She coughed, eyes streaming, but never faltered. By dawn, the bunkhouse was ash. The men gathered, bruised, angry, afraid. Hammer's fury was a storm barely contained, his fists bloodied from striking walls. Harriet, her face streaked with soot, spoke with calm finality. This is no longer about cattle. Farnsworth wants to break us body and spirit. We cannot wait for him to strike again. We must take the fight to him. The words shocked the men. Mallisters had always defended, never attacked. But Harriet's voice left no room for doubt. Hammer turned to her, eyes sharp. You're saying we ride against him? She met his gaze, unflinching. Yes, we end this war on our terms, not his. Preparations began at once. Riders sharpened blades, cleaned rifles, packed supplies. Harriet studied maps by lantern light, marking routes, weighing risks. Jude stood beside her, silent but steady, while Hammer paced like a caged lion. On the eve of their ride, Harriet walked alone to the porch. The prairie stretched endless, stars cold above. She whispered into the night, words not meant for men but for the land itself. I did not choose this war, but I will finish it. The next morning they rode, not in secrecy, but in full sight of Dodge City. The thunder of hooves echoed through the streets, dust rising like storm clouds. Townsfolk watched, whispers chasing them, but none dared stand in their way. Harriet rode at the front, her face calm, her eyes hard as flint dot at Farnsworth's estate. Guards scrambled at the sight of the oncoming riders. Gates shuddered, rifles cocked. Farnsworth himself stood on the veranda, lips curling into a sneer. "So," he muttered, "the cattle baron brings his plain wife to my doorstep." The standoff stretched, breathless. Harriet's voice rang, clear across the distance. "This ends here. No more raids. No more fire. No more lies. You stand down or you fall." Farnsworth laughed, the sound sharp as glass. "And if I don't?" Her hand rested on her holster, her gaze unblinking. "Then the land will decide which of us belongs to it." Behind her, Mallister's men raised their rifles. Farnsworth's guns answered, barrels gleaming in the sun. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The feud had reached its peak. Pride, land, survival all hung in the balance. And as Harriet sat tall in her saddle, the dust rising around her, one truth was clear. This was no longer just a battle for cattle or empire. This was a fight for the very soul of the frontier. The air between Mallister and Farnsworth hung taut as a wire. On one side, Harriet and Hammer with outside, the gunfire dwindled as Farnsworth's men, seeing their leader fall, broke and fled. The Mallisters stood victorious, though weary, battered, and scarred. Harriet walked to the veranda, her figure outlined against the rising sun. She looked upon her men, dusty, wounded, but alive, and raised her voice. "This land is ours because we stand together. Remember this day. We did not win by hatred or by fear. We won because we refused to bend." The cheer that rose shook the air, carrying across the plains like a hymn. Yet even as they celebrated, Harriet's eyes turned to the horizon. She knew the prairie never stayed quiet for long. Rivalries would rise, storms would come, and the land would demand more sacrifices. But in that moment, she also knew something greater. She had carved her name into the soil of the frontier, not as a baron's wife, not as a plain woman, but as a leader, as unyielding as the plains themselves. The feud was over, Farnsworth undone, Mallister Range secured. But in the hush after battle, one truth echoed across the prairie. Empires rise, empires fall, but the land remembers those who fought for it with courage unshaken and hearts unbroken. They etched the last lines of their journey across the boundless frontier, side by side, building a bond stronger than cattle, wealth, or land. Harriet Blake Mallister had shown the world that respect is not earned through beauty or charm, but through courage, vision, and a spirit that will not break. And Hammer Mallister, once the untouchable cattle baron of Kansas, discovered a treasure greater than any herd could bring, the loyalty of his people and the love of a woman who transformed his destiny. If this tale of grit, love, and frontier justice stirred your heart, ride with us further, tap that like button, share this story with fellow lovers of the Old West, and subscribe to our channel.